Adventures in Mortuary Archaeology and Commemoration. It's Archaeodeath.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to my latest Archaeodeath interview, where we're joined by burial archaeologist and Viking Age expert Matthias. Matthias, would you be willing to introduce yourself, and we can get started with some exciting explorations of the Viking world and death stuff?
Yeah, first of all, many thanks for being invited. It's an honor for me, and it's highly interesting to speak about these topics with the burial archaeologist expert, goddess himself. Yeah, I am a Viking Age archaeologist, trained Viking Age archaeologist, and I'm currently head of the Viking Museum in Hedeby. So I'm sitting on one of the hotspots of Viking Age archaeology, to be honest.
You're living and working in the Viking Age in some way there, aren't you? You're really at the center of everything. That's fantastic. And it's been many years since I've been in that part of the world, but it's a really exciting to be able to talk to you and to learn a bit about your research, and then maybe we could even at the end talk about the museum a little bit. But I mean, I really wanted to get a sense for people who watch these videos and want to learn, how do you get into archaeology? I always sort of start off by asking, how did you get into the subject? Where did it all begin for you, and how did it develop?
It's a difficult question. I was always fascinated by the past, and I remember that I forced my parents to visit every archaeological spot during our vacations, maybe in some boring stone circle in Scotland, or Olympia in Greece. And I wasted the entire film and the photograph of my parents by photographing rows and rows and rows of stones, and I left nothing for family pictures. Something am hearing today. And the Viking Age was always very familiar to me. So these relatives from a distant past, you can say, and I tried to read everything I could get about the Vikings as preteen and teen. And as my mother was working in a bookshop, this was quite a lot, as you can imagine. So I tried to force my way into this highly fascinating time. And I'm still inside.
It's a funny thing that I've been slow in getting into the Vikings, actually. Although I do remember buying with one of my first pocket monies aged about 8, the David Wilson sort of book, Vikings and Their Origins, in a larger scale, because they did later paperbacks, but there was a hardback, and it was such a beautiful product, and sort of picture book, but with some text. And I've still got that. But yes, we get inspired at an early age, and you went on to do university, PhD. What was your focus there? How did you sort of academically engage with the topic?
Yeah, I started my studies in Cologne, which is not the hotspot for Viking Age archaeology, but I started with Old Norse studies. So all this fascinating Icelandic literature, old Icelandic literature, runes, and so on, and archaeology. And then for my PhD, I moved to Tübingen, where the late Jörn Stecker was professor, one of the experts of at least Gotlandic Viking Age archaeology, and made my PhD on a burial field and a cemetery on Gotland, Koppersvik, which is highly fascinating in many ways. And I tried to mix archaeology and Old Norse studies, which turned out not to be very fruitful, to be honest, but it was a funny time at least. So from the first days of university, I somehow run into the Viking Age.
That's really interesting. What an opportunity to work with Jörn, and also to work on Gotland, because from as an outsider, as someone who sort of looks at the Viking Age from the popular books as a starting point, you see a lot of Gotland, but I think a lot of Gotland gets misused to represent other places, doesn't it? So perhaps you could give us a little introduction to Gotland and its Viking Age, and then how you pursued your investigations.
As you said, Gotland is highly fascinating. Gotland is sometimes misused to represent the entire Viking Age. And looking at the former exhibition at the Statens Historiska Museum in Stockholm, it was full of Gotlandic material representing Viking Age Sweden, which was great for me as a Gotland nerd, but not that scientific. Gotland is special in many ways. It's not normal Scandinavian Viking Age, and it's not the Eastern Baltic, but it's something on its own. There are many traces that are missing on other places, such as these famous picture stones, So large stones, almost similar to rune stones, but with pictorial, um, um, with pictures on it, some kind of comic strips, which give us access to parts of Viking Age mythology, for example. So we have this picture of a warrior, or maybe Odin himself, approaching Valhalla on a eight-legged horse. We are lacking ship burials on Gotland, for example.
Yes, yeah.
Which is interesting because we have many depictions of ships on these picture stones. So
Yes, yeah.
it's a community on its own, and it remained a community on its own up to today, I would say.
That's really interesting. It's like the Baltic version of the Isle of Man. I always think about it. That's why I explain it to I know that sounds ridiculous, but to British people, I say, it's like the Isle of Man. It's not really Ireland. It's not really Scotland. It's not really Wales. Certainly not England. It sits on its own. And I think islands tend to do that. But it's not only got the picture stones. It's also got some major trading sites, and it's full of silver, isn't it? And other things that set it apart. And brooches, crazy brooches that are beyond anything.
Gotland was, for a long time, even in the higher Middle Ages, the stepstone for all these trading ventures to the east. So it's the most eastern outpost of the, let's say, Scandinavian Viking world, in the homelands of Scandinavia, at least.
Do you your choice to look at one burial site? How did that come about, and why that site? And
the site of Coppersvik
Coppersvik,
is the largest only Viking Age cemetery on the island, and it was lying south of present-day Visby. So it might have belonged to the predecessor of Visby, one of the first trading posts, and the, I guess, most important one, with more than 330 burials on Coppersvik, and they had two very interesting phenomena. The one is prone burials.
Yeah.
So quite a large number of deceased were buried in a prone position, which is somehow unusual, and which is something that we as modern people understand as something negative.
Yeah.
Like biting the dust, so some vampiric deviant burial or something like this. And we have a high number of male individuals with filed teeth, which was also very new at this time.
Oh, of course, right. Yeah. And so that was what, you got a really good data set, but also some very, I'd say unusual, shows my biases, but some very distinctive practices. Yeah.
Yeah, it was something that was known for more than 50 years. It was excavated in the 1960s, but no one has touched the material. Maybe because there were some riddles to solve, such as the prone burials.
So how did you go about it, and what did you find, and what was your thoughts on the meaning of well, let's start with the prone burials, because I've come across prone burials in early Anglo-Saxon contexts. I had students have written undergraduate theses on this topic and tried to suggest, but it's not easy to unpick what it might mean. What was your thoughts on prone burial?
The classical interpretation which I came across at first is, of course, something like a deviant burial.
Yeah.
Criminals or revenants or something like this, people you would like to stay in the ground, which is, I guess, true with many of these execution cemeteries in Anglo-Saxon England. But the prone burials on Coppersvik and also on many other spots in Gotland are different from this, because there is nothing deviant about them. They're just lying in a prone position. They have their jewelry with them. In parts they are equipped with knives or other dress accessories. So they look rather like a usual burial, but just in this prone position. And there is this interesting written source about the burial of Pippian the Younger, the father of Charlemagne, who demanded to be buried in a prone position at the entrance of the cathedral in Saint-Denis, as a to show piety. So it's a Christian gesture, something which is still common in the Catholic Church, for example, with this lying in a prone position in front of the altar. So my idea was that this is nothing deviant, but some kind of gesture before God, perhaps related to this ritual of the Primsegning, so the first step into becoming a Christian, which was something that was used during the Christianization of Scandinavia. So these people buried in a prone position might have been people that were not fully Christian. They were not baptized yet, but they died in the state of being educated as being proper Christians.
And this is I should have asked what chronology is this cemetery? Is it a tight, narrow chronology, or is it a broad ranging, covering both sides of the official conversion times?
Our chronology is rather difficult. We do not have any scientific results, so we can just date from the finding material. And
Okay.
it seems that the first burials are dating to the later 9th century, but most of the burials are 10th and 11th century. So we're in the later phase, and we have evidence for Christian burials. So there was one grave with a small cross. There are some burials encircled with stones, which might reflect this idea of bordering a Christian burial. So we are actually in this time of conversion.
And in many ways, for that part of the world, the entire Viking Age is a conversion era, isn't it? I still come across the misunderstanding that online that people think there was a moment where Christians invaded like crusaders and slaughtered anyone that wouldn't convert as a moment of like something out of a Ridley Scott film, you know. But we can rule that out, can't we? It was a longer, more messy process.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the major misunderstandings, or one of the major myths I come across here at the museum when people are visiting the museum, and they are almost upset when we're speaking about Christian Vikings, because Hedeby was a hotspot for Christianization, and we got the first mission here in the middle of the 9th century, so at the beginning of the Viking Age.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is something which is normally not depicted in most of these Viking televisions.
So there was never really a time in that part of the Baltic where Christianity was unknown, but equally, it took a long time for the church to establish itself with ecclesiastical frameworks and centres. So it's centuries in which people are almost experimenting with different forms of Christianity as they're going down collectively this conversion path. So you'd expect different things, Christianity, to express itself differently than elsewhere, wouldn't you? Because it would take so long, and there was nobody, single person, sort of directing it. There was a bishop in Hamburg, but that wasn't. I don't know how early that happened and how far their influence goes. I mean, I'm interested in that type of thing. Do we think that Christianity was about institutions at all at that period, or is it more about family and community? I don't know.
I guess we have a very long phase, maybe centuries, between the time when Christianity came to the north as a belief in this God, maybe even ideas of being buried without all this chivalry, and the time when a real institutionalization of the church begins, with all these rules that come with Christianity. So I think in the Viking Age we have to accept or to understand that there might be Christian burials intended as being Christian burial, which might look distinctly pagan from our archaeologist perspective. So nothing we would expect from a proper Christian burial.
And that's, I mean, just for people's benefit, the other flip side, you mentioned it, but this whole everyone wants everything to be a vampire burial has become a bit of a problem, hasn't it? Not just for the Viking Age, but obviously our colleague Leci Gadewa has been addressing this as well. But the pop culture is every burial from the 18th century back to the 8th century. And I've even seen certain reports by archaeologists talking to the media, talking about Neolithic burials. Anything that's under a big stone, anything that's upside, prone, any burial where there's bone moved, it was thought to be a vampire. And I'm not saying that's wrong in every case, but when we see archaeological phenomena like that, we have to remember there may be many other explanations for why people bury the dead. It's not, they weren't obsessed with the dead rising again all the time, were they?
Yeah, I think it's the same with the ideas of what's a proper Christian burial. We're far too often with our modern conceptions of a proper burial or of a good treatment of the deceased looking at burials, and which must not be necessarily the same as people did in the Viking Age. So we have to, step a little bit back from our modern perceptions of how to deal with the dead.
So when you say there were prone burials, are we talking, I mean, what fraction? And when you say they're treated like others, did they also have grave goods like other burials, or were they a mix?
So we have 330 burials in total, and around 40 burials in a prone position, which is a large number. And most of the burials were such dress burials. So the deceased were buried in their, let's say, best Sunday dress, with brooches, with belts, with knives, and all the stuff they need in everyday life, actually. Real grave goods such as weapons are very rare at Koppersvik, which is normal in late Viking Age Gotland.
Okay.
And these prone burials are not differing in any way from the other burials. So we have people being buried in their best Sunday dress, people with knives, not with weapons, but with at least knives. Nothing
So,
that would give a revenant.
So they didn't just like tip into the burials in their Sunday best. These are people who are dressed. Care, respect is gone into their treatment. So it'd be odd if they were placed prone by accident or as a sign of disrespect, when so much care and attention has been gone into the preparation burial. That makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah, it's difficult to reconcile this as a sign of fear or disrespect. Yeah, I see that now. The lack of weapons, though. I mean, we, again, for audiences who may hear a lot of misinformation, we don't equate weapons exactly with warriors, do we? I mean, so the absence of weapons doesn't mean they weren't, some of them a part of martial communities, it's just a broader chronological trend of decreasing weapon burial.
It's a chronological trend which might also be related to social developments of the Viking Age. But yes, normally we would expect in the early Viking Age on Gotland, for example, on cemeteries such as Brua or Ire, there are lots of at least male individuals buried with weapons. And on the later cemeteries such as Koppersvik or Havur, weapons are very, very rare. It's simply not common to bury your deceased with weapons.
That's really interesting.
Something I would like to add to this prone burial, there is a beautiful triple burial. A female and two male burials, and the female is buried in a prone position, and the males, one is buried supine and the other one lying on the side, holding the female in his arm. So this is definitely some kind of someone who was loved, who was buried in a very respectful way, even if it's prone.
This is reminds us of just how varied death rituals are in past societies, and people are responding to individual circumstances. And it's the people are buried in relation to the earlier graves and the people that are dying at around the same time. Whatever there's a lot of complexity to the choices and care gone into by the community and the kin to bury these people. That's really, when we see those relationships, it does make it very. It humanizes, but it also reminds us that we don't have all the answers. We can't sort of go back in time and get inside people's brains and work out why they did things. But it shows that it's about care and community, isn't it? It's not all just about dramatic theatre and gestures as we see in TV shows. And
yeah, I guess it might be a mixture. Or the average burial is, I guess, more about emotion, about grief, about respect and love. But there's also this, I get this dramatic aspect of a burial being a religious ceremony.
Yeah.
And even a ceremony for the society surrounding it.
And so I mean, just pushing this idea further, if you're in a community that is going through Christian conversion over generations, you'd be hard pressed to have a public event where there weren't people on a spectrum of sort of affiliations or practices. There's always going to be some pagans. There's always going to be some different levels of intensity of Christians, and funerals are religious, but they're not necessarily exclusively about one particular vision. No, you can't. So do you think that's a fair comment, or do you think that's perhaps misleading? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are two newer publications which illustrate this about Gotland. On the one hand, we have this churchyard burials, so the establishment of the first churches on Gotland, quite a lot, 93 in total, mostly in the later 10th or in the 11th and 12th century, and the establishment of churchyards surrounding these churches where the first Christians were buried. And it's a typical Gotlandic trait that these people were buried in their best dresses. So in contrast to the Christian burial we would expect in a coffin or in a shroud without any grave goods or any dress accessories and jewelries. And there is a new paper by some Swedish colleagues that show that these churchyard dress burials are lasting much longer than expected to the 12th to the 13th century. So there's a very long phase of transformation. And on the opposite side, I had this interesting aspect when I was working on the cemetery of Haithabu in southern Gotland. It's a cemetery that starts in the later Iron Age. And in the later Viking Age, in the 11th or even 12th century, in an already mostly Christian society, the people were burying their dead in the older graves, even though there was a church with a churchyard nearby. So they had the choice to either bury their Christian deceased next to the church or in the graves of their presumed ancestors. And they decided later to bury in these older graves.
I mean, in a society like that, one wonders whether our fixation on categorization of, we're archaeologists, we like to categorize things, but I think that's legitimate, and sometimes we need tight typologies. But when you have sites like that, labeling them Christian or pagan it's kind of, if you're trying to understand that particular period, yes, in the long term, of course, we have to use those labels. I'm not denying people had a Christian faith. What I mean is, it's very difficult to be demonstrative about how we split that up if they had those choices available to them. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So it may be no one would have even remembered a time when they didn't have those options, because we're looking at a human experience that's centuries of overlap. That's really difficult to get my head around. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if someone that was burying a deceased who was believing in Christ in a older pagan cemetery, if this was understood as being a contrast to Christian burial rituals or burial ideas, or if this was just about caring for your deceased.
I think that's the case, isn't it? Because I mean, there's many, even in the most hardline missionary context in the colonial era, it's still very difficult for missionaries to control everything that is going on at a ceremony. And certainly the vicars I've talked to, you have some very different attitudes to it about every kind of ceremony. But the anecdotes you hear about what happens in and around churches, even today, it's quite, I said, Vicar, you're not supposed to do it. No, not really. It's not supposed to happen. But what can you do? And it's like, I mean, that may have been an exceptional one. I won't go into all the anecdotes, but I just sort of sitting there with my jaw dropped, listening to this story about what happened at a funeral or a wedding, and I go, but. Anyway. But yes, I mean, you can't. People will do crazy and different and traditional things, and the weight of tradition, on those societies is going to weigh heavily, isn't it? That's fascinating. So do you within your sort of Coppersbeak cemetery, you had the prone burials, and then you've got this broader sort of, it's part of a broader, slow trend of Christianization, if we should even call it that. And then you have these teeth, this modification of teeth. I mean, I knew about this first from the Weymouth Ridgeway mass burial of Vikings, or maybe some of them Slavs now, if you believe the isotope analysis. But you've got Scandinavian, Slavic, Baltic peoples, who end up having a dismal time in Dorset. It's like a bad holiday, and they get massacred. And at least one of them has these striations on their teeth, and then it's just gone massive, hasn't it? And we've got lots of these, but Gotland is a hot spot for this particular distinctive dental modification. For my viewers, listeners who haven't really encountered this before, could you give us a little introduction as what's all that about? What does it look like, and what's it about?
Yeah, it's a quite new phenomenon. I guess the first cases were found in the 1990s, and it took almost 20 years before research realized about this phenomenon. And up to date, we have more than 100 individuals, almost all of them male. There is a new find that might be a female, which is still not very certain. Okay. And so up to date, all of them males in all ages, and mostly focused on Gotland. So I think more than 60 of them are coming from Gotland, although at least buried and found in Gotland. And there were, of course, many explanations, and the Weymouth was, of course, the steps down to interpret all this as being the Viking's grim grin. So some kind of body modification for a Viking warrior to look more gruesome and whatever, show their resistance to pain and all this stuff. But the problem is, or not the problem, but the situation is that almost all of them are lacking, on the one hand, weapons, and on the other hand, any evidence for conflict-related wounds. So there was almost none of them in a fighting situation, at least as far as we can tell from archaeology. And my idea, which I came up with together with a Swedish archaeologist, Carolina Cini, was that this might be related to early trading communities, such as later medieval guilds, which are already mentioned on Viking Age runestones. So we know that there are some kind of proto-guilds already in the late Viking Age. And I assume that these 5 Ts might be some very, a hidden sign of identification for these members of these trading communities, because most of these fightings were performed by a professional. So it's not just getting a file and finding your teeth, but it's something that someone was doing deliberately on certain occasions. And I can imagine that when you were part of these trading communities and you came to a new trading place, you could reveal yourself by just showing your front teeth and identify yourself as a member of a certain group. And so you got better prizes or whatever.
I mean, just rolling it back a bit, I like that idea. I must admit, I've gone back and forward trying to think this through, and I'm convinced by, I'm certain, I'm convinced by I'm convinced by this because, I mean, this is really superficial, and this is like, I've got worse eyesight. I used to have good eyesight, right? But, I never had perfect eyesight. But even when I had really great eyesight, the idea that a group of warriors coming towards you in a battle, the first thing you notice is their teeth modification. I think you'll notice their weapons, their helmets, their shields, the shield, there's lots of things you're going to be worried about. Then the noise they're making, the what they're saying they're going to do to you, more than the detail of their teeth. The idea that people are going to be able to identify each other on a battlefield or be intimidated by teeth. I know it sounds cool, but I really don't find that at all convincing just on that superficial practical term. But then the evidence is surely, yes, one of them happened to die violently, presumably on a raid, but we don't even know if it was on a raid to a West Saxon territory. But that doesn't mean anything. So I'm very much, that idea of a trading guild, or at least a secret sign of some community of that is homosocial, it's to do with men and their roles in society, that makes much more sense, doesn't it? And and it's, yes, you might be able to spot it, but they're really high grooves, aren't they? You have to create some really weird facial expressions if you want people to see that from afar. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, it's really clandestine. So you have to show your teeth, because normally when I'm speaking, you're not seeing my front teeth. And actually, there is a Polish reenactor who did this to his teeth, or at least in an artificial way.
Okay.
And he's a really cool guy and absolutely into archaeology. But I was speaking with him some years ago, and I realized, oh, there's something crude with his teeth. So I took a closer look, and I asked him, what did you do to your teeth? Oh, I've got this teeth falling like a Viking warrior. Okay, so we were speaking about for almost 10 minutes, and I didn't realize that you have these 5 teeth. So it's nothing you see at first sight.
Oh, anecdotal though that may be, I think that's pretty. I mean, we're in a society where we don't usually talk about each other's appearance, like although I know some characters in archaeology who have always put their foot in it with various personal comments about each other, but most people have a politeness. But I can't imagine a scenario where that would be the thing you'd be noticing at a trading site unless someone reveals it to you. Yeah, absolutely. So the Gotland is a trading hub. Most of them are on Gotland, but obviously people are going to die out and about, so it may be some kind of Gotlandic trading guild, and it makes us wonder what else we're missing, doesn't it? There may be other ways in which people mark themselves as part of communities that you'd only know because you're traveling maybe once a year, and people needed to identify themselves as reliable, as representatives, or why would you trade with them? It makes absolute sense, because you can easily change your clothing, change your hairstyle, and go, can't you see I'm a member of the guild because I've got no beard, or I have a beard, but that's not going to work. You need an indelible sign, an indelible message, and that makes sense to me. So does everyone buy into it, or is there an argument going on, as there's always arguments in academia, or is that the kind of consensus view now?
Actually, I'm not quite sure. I think this idea of warrior identity is still popping up because of Viking warriors. It always felt. There was also the idea that this might be a marker for slaves.
Yeah.
Which, in my opinion, does not work, because we have individuals being buried with dress accessories, with knives, and you would not bury your slave with a knife. This does not make any sense to me. So I guess there's, of course, not still a lot to discuss, especially when we realize that we just know of around, I guess, 100 individuals, and I guess there are quite more somewhere in the ground. We do not have any evidence from Norway up to date. So I would expect some individuals whose file teeth from Norway, and perhaps there are even some females beyond them. So there is still a lot going on, and this makes it highly interesting as archaeologists.
And it's another example of why there's no single Viking Age. There's so many different regional and local traditions going on, and but yeah, the warrior stuff is almost every, I think I may have, this shows how I come late to a lot of topics that I perhaps should find earlier, and I read about bits of it, as I said, but I don't think I came across your work on this till after I did a video where I just kind of guessed that it was nothing to, well, I can't not guess, but I'd read some stuff and people claiming online it's to do with Viking warriors, and I gone no, and I hadn't got such a clear interpretation as yours, but I'd gone surely not, surely it's this, and then I found, oh yeah, and this is what other people are arguing. But it's so seductive. Everyone wants a sort of iconic Viking warrior, and this is a new sort of tick in the box that we can add to the list of sort of edgy things that made the warrior different. But I mean, I think any early medieval, we're all dealing with martial societies where there's a military element, but surely all of these communities would have been investing in more prominent ways of displaying their identity as warriors than filing their teeth. Like anyway. But do you think that's a broader problem in terms of the way we think about the Viking Age?
Yes, absolutely. We have these popular ideas and the popular myth about the Viking Age, and even we as archaeologists, or at least I as archaeologist, I'm not completely free of these ideas. And when someone mentions the Vikings, my first idea is, of course, even a Viking warrior, because it's a society which is based on this ideology of a male as the fully weaponed male as being a warrior, even though most of the males in Viking Age Scandinavia were fishermen or farmers or whatever, and might never have been in a battle. But it's a part of their society. So I guess we need to reanalyze this term, warrior. What's a warrior in Viking Age society? What does this mean for this entire period?
I must admit I was deliberately winding people up on in some of my social media content by saying, if you wanted a martial feature that defines the Viking, it's being good at being cowards and running away, because I was trying to make the obvious point. I mean, that's what raiding is you go in quick and come out as quickly as you can. You don't want to get into pitched battles, but the number of people got into their feelings over that. I got such hate for that. I mean, I did it on purpose, obviously, because I was trying to get people to think about our preconceived ideas. I'm not saying anyone was a coward in the past, whatever that may mean, but what I'm trying to say is, if you want to define the Viking Age raid raiding, at least raiding activities, not bigger armies and the later Viking Age. But if you've got to think about it's not about pitch battles. It's about getting in, getting what you need, and running away or sailing away, rowing away as quickly as possible. I mean, so if you want a masculine feature, it's being able to row really fast in shallow draft boats. That's the Viking, not being able to sort of stand there 8 foot tall, swinging your axe on Stamford Bridge, to, whatever it may be. But anyway, that's perhaps but you've addressed this martial theme in your most recent work. I was looking at your paper on women's artifacts and graves. I'd love to hear some of your ideas on that broader, because you're not just on Gotland. You've been contributing to all manner of debates on Viking archaeology. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's a paper I wrote together with my dear friend and colleague Leszek Adela.
Yes.
We did a lot of these miniature weapon amulets. So we took a closer look on weapon-related artifacts and female burials in Viking Age Scandinavia, because we have this never-ending discussion on shield maidens and female Viking warriors,
yes.
at least due to this famous Bøker burial. And there are actually some female burials with single weapons inside, but there are far more female burials with smaller amulets that are somehow related to the sphere of warfare and weapons and combat and whatever. For example, small weapon amulets, so miniature weapons, swords, spears, shields, but also, and this is something I find highly interesting, elements of the male warrior's dress that are reworked into female dress. For example, belts, fittings that were reworked as jewelry or as brooches. I guess the most famous example for Viking Age Scandinavia are these trefoil brooches, which are characteristic of the dress, at least in southern Scandinavia. So we have dozens, hundreds of them here in Hedeby. But they originate from the sword belt of the Frankish warriors. So something taken from the male sphere of warfare, a sign of the Frankish warrior, was remade into part of the female dress, which is highly interesting. Why did they do this? What was the meaning behind? And I don't have an answer to this. It's one of the riddles of Viking Age Scandinavia. But we took up this idea that was developed by one of our godfathers of archaeology, a British professor, Howard Williams, with this idea of
never heard of it.
Mnemonic material references. So this
Yes.
idea of mnemonic citations, that these miniature aspects of the sphere of warfare somehow refer to certain people, places, events, or maybe ideas. And by this, incorporating this female sphere into the sphere of warfare, or at least this warrior ideology, without that this female were actually fighting or using weapons in a proper sense as we would.
Yeah, so there's so much to the symbolism and citations, because it's not just simply about meaning worlds. It's about, people would have been seeing these objects and understanding them as, having some kind of efficacy, in telling stories, or telling, of connecting people to each other. That's really fascinating. Yeah, so actually women are sort of a lot of women's dress has elements that would have been perhaps overtly seen as martial, even if they're not functioning weapons. That's really amazing. Yeah. And so this leads me, I have a couple of we're not wrapping up yet, but I have a couple of where that leads to. You're doing ongoing research. I wanted to ask about museums next, but first I wanted to ask, so where are you going with your research now? You've done all this work on Gotland and on where do you think you'll be heading next, if you have time in your other busy schedule?
That's a good question. I'm still somehow looking at Gotland, because it's where my heart is.
Yeah.
But of course, Hedeby is a very important aspect for me, because I need to understand this site, and understanding the site means for me to do my own research on it. But still, this idea of burial archaeology and what do burials actually tell is a highly interesting one, because most of the burials here in Hedeby are quite, let's say, boring, because they're almost Christian, without any grave goods. But we have these chamber graves, and we have this special boat chamber burial, which is highly interesting because it's unique in its kind. The combination of two burial rites we know from the Viking Age, the boat burial and the chamber burial, but in this combination, it's one of a kind. And this is something I would like to focus on.
More than even Hedeby, but Birka, but also Hedeby, I think for many people they're a problem because they're a problem for me in telling the story of the Viking Age as a teacher because they're so dominant. And yet they're not typical, like the Hedeby burials, which I know less well, but the Birka burials are they're not, there's nothing typical of Scandinavian or Northern European society. And therefore they're really important. We understand, but equally they get used as the iconic examples when they aren't anything but. I mean, how does that work through in terms of how you work in a museum and tell the story of the Viking Age? Because Hedeby is so important, and yet no one would say it's typical of anything. It's such a pivotal site for trading, and you tell me. Sorry, I want to know.
Yeah, but it's exactly this. It's the same with this warrior idea. Birka and Hedeby are dominating the entire view on the Viking Age, and this is a problem because at least Hedeby there's not that much about Viking about this settlement, because it's not a Viking city or Viking fortress or whatever it might be called, but it's a proto-urban trading hub which was inhabited by Danish people, by Franks, Frisians, Slavonic people, all of the kind. So it's a melting pot, and this makes it highly interesting. For us, Hedeby is special because it's the only spot we have in Germany. So when you're searching for the Vikings in Germany, the first thing you come to is Hedeby. So it's normally the place where all people being interested about the Viking Age in Germany start their research. They come to us, they read about Hedeby, which is great for us, but which might give them a biased perspective on the Viking Age. But in the museum, we can use this settlement to illustrate almost all aspects which are characteristic of the Viking Age by this material from Hedeby. So we have all this trading aspect, this trading network with Hedeby in focus. We have, of course, the warrior identity, so people can see swords and axes in Hedeby if they want. We have these famous burials showing this, let's say, dramatic burial rituals that were also part of the Viking Age. But we also have the small fishermen, we have the small carpenters, the handcraft activities. In fact, we can highlight everything about the Viking Age just through the lenses of Hedeby, which makes it a very special place for us.
And in that mix, you actually have, as well as museum finds from many phases of excavation, you do have earthworks, you do have fortifications, you have, so that is something people can tangibly connect to in a way you can't often do.
Yeah, we have this great situation that the museum is situated next to the original spot. We have this large fortification, the semicircular rampart, which is also very impressive in a way. So people can at least understand the size of Hedeby. And we have this open air museum with 7 reconstructed houses where people can enter the actual Viking Age, so they can experience many aspects of the Viking Age with all the senses, so they can touch, they can smell, they can perhaps even taste. And I think that's very good on a low scale to get people being interested in archaeology and the Viking Age especially.
And why do you think, this is the question we were discussing recently when we had the delightful 2 days actually in a workshop addressing these issues, and but I do want to ask about your ongoing work relating to why you think people like the Vikings, which I know is a complicated topic, but what, from your perspective, I know you've got some really interesting ideas about the draw, the appeal of the Vikings, because why the Bronze Age doesn't get this attention? Why doesn't the later Middle Ages? Yeah, there's lots of people like all sorts of things about the past, but the Viking Age has a particular cachet, doesn't it? So what do you think it's all about? Why do people love Vikings?
I think they do not love the Viking Age, but they love what they made of the Viking Age in recent times, in their certain time. Because the Vikings are, as I said at the beginning, they are relatives from a distant past. They may be part of our own history, of our own identity, but at the same time, they are the absolute antidote to us. They are these uncivilized, harsh people that are always setting up for an adventure. So it's this idea of breaking free, of adventure, of freedom, of authenticity,
Yeah.
that are connected with this idea of the Vikings as we have with this, let's say, 21st century Viking Age. So there is some escapistic idea about the Vikings. Vikings. So this concept of retutopia I talked about.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so this past that you can mate to a better present, or this desired path which you can form according to all your needs, ideologies, beliefs in our times. When we look how the Vikings are presented in TV shows, this has almost nothing to do with the archaeological Viking Age, but with
No.
our present time, with gender equality and the aesthetics that are shown today. So the Viking Age can be a lot for us today.
I mean, it's such a blessing and a curse, as I think you phrased it, that we have, or it's so positive and yet so frustrating that we have these many misconceptions. With your own social media or your own role as trying to tell the story at Haithabu, do you come across surprising misunderstandings? There's obvious ones that you can map from pop culture to, visitor experience, but are there any surprising things that people, I mean, do they get angry that their stereotypes are not, enforced or supported, or do they do you get unusual questions that are perhaps out of the ordinary?
Unusual questions, sure, I get a lot of them, but it's difficult to remember.
No,
Um, but one of the major misunderstandings is, of course, that the Vikings are often believed to be some ethnic people. The
yeah,
Vikings understand themselves as Vikings when they're sitting in Scandinavia and then they die out in the 11th century. And people are always surprised when we're telling them that the Vikings were not the Vikings, but the Danes, Norwegians, whatever. And Vikings just something you can do in a certain moment, and most people did not at this time. And of course, this idea of religion and mythology, because we have all this fascinating myth about the Viking Age written down in this Eddic and the Eddic literature, which are highly fascinating. I totally love this story, but they have nothing to do, or at least not that much to do, with the Viking Age. And it's always difficult to convince the audience that we know less about mythology and beliefs of the Viking Age than people always think, and that the Viking Age is this phase of transformation to Christianity.
yeah.
And this is, in fact, something that upsets some people.
Yeah. I'm facing a torrent online at the moment of people angry, including, to my disappointment, many Scandinavians who are angry. I learnt this in school. Why are you telling me these lies? And I'm literally, I'm not saying anything radical. I'm not really a Viking archaeologist. I'm dealing with this as someone who comes from other slightly earlier and outside, and yet, wow, the level of anger, personal, people feel really personally aggrieved when I share, some very basic points that are in all of the books. I'm not saying anything radical, but I'm saying these points you've just made about it's not an ethnic group. You can't be a Viking. You can't. You can. As a joke, you can claim to be descended from Vikings, but no one takes that seriously. Surely, I mean, I can be saying I'm descended from bakers, but it doesn't mean it doesn't. No one's really making it their personal. Oh, but they do. It's their personal, identity. Wow. So yeah, I thought it would be getting better, but no, it's never going away, it seems. But yeah, yeah.
But this shows that the Vikings are very important for many people today. Also detached from this academic perspective. And I think that this is something that we as academics should focus on, because there are many people that have a high interest in the Viking Age, and this is something we should also respect in a way.
Oh yes, it's. I wouldn't dismiss it. No,
Yes.
yeah,
but many colleagues do.
Yeah.
It's this moment when discussions pop up and people are perhaps upset by some of our academic perspectives on the Viking Age. Some colleagues just stop the discussion, and I think it's important to understand what people think about the Viking Age, because it's part of our job to speak with them, to perhaps not convince, but to discuss the Viking Age and what the Viking Age might be for us today on eye level. And I love this more about the antebellum period in the US, and we can also term it for the Vikings. The Viking Age is not forgotten. It's not still not past. No, it's sorry.
Yes, I see your point.
It's not forgotten. It's not even past.
No.
So the Viking Age still somehow exists.
I think that's, so we are living in a Viking Age, or at least it's in our minds constantly. I mean, people talk about, there's an online meme about people thinking about the Roman Empire every day, but for many people, the Vikings still exist in our daily existence. It's not to be mocked, but it's difficult to reconcile the level of personal investment in it, but it's something we should certainly not shy away from. And I think that's why I think it's so important that people see individuals like you who are working simultaneously. You've got your academic scholarship, you're one of the leading lights of burial archaeology in the Viking Age, and you're working in a museum trying to tell those stories. That's why I think it's so absolutely exciting that you've been able to share these perspectives with us. Is there any final sort of thoughts or reflections you have before we for this discussion, and anything that you think we've missed out, or anything you want to emphasize, or
There is nothing we missed, I guess. Just to emphasize, I think it's brilliant to see how the past can evolve and what the past makes with us. So it's we're not living in the present. We're always living in the past and in the future at the same time. And that's why I think there is still this Viking Age, even if it might be a different Viking Age from this of the 10th century. And I'm totally happy to be able to live in exactly this time, to speak about this period, and to be at this wonderful place, and to discuss this aspect with so many brilliant colleagues like you.
Oh, and 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about these precise issues. Yes, we'd be talking about the same terms, but we wouldn't have been able to have this conversation talking about prone burials, about these new discoveries, these heritage issues. So it's been absolutely a delight, Matthias, and I really appreciate the time you've taken to talk to me. And I hope you have wish you all the very best for your museum and for your research, and let's keep telling those stories and challenging those misconceptions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. It was an honor.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.